What do you mean the entire system is down? CEO Richard Hale's voice echoed through the sleek glass walls of the conference room. The heads of department exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale with tension. The company's entire operations had ground to a halt. Servers unresponsive, data inaccessible, and every employee sitting idly at their desks. "We've tried everything, sir," said Mark, the lead IT engineer. "The entire infrastructure crashed and none of the backup systems are working. Our external consultants estimate at least 48 hours to get things running again." Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. 2 days of downtime would cost them millions. Investors were watching. Clients were growing impatient. And worst of all, they were on the verge of launching a new product, the biggest one in the company's history. "We don't have 48 hours, Richard snapped. "We need a solution now." His words hung in the air, thick with urgency. Then, from the back of the room, a quiet but firm voice spoke up. "I can fix it." The entire boardroom turned toward the speaker. Standing near the doorway, holding a mop in one hand and a rag in the other, was Carl Dawson. The office janitor did a moment of silence. Then laughter. "That's cute," one of the executives muttered. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Carl. But this is a highly complex system failure, not a clogged sink." Carl, unfazed, took a step forward. His piercing blue eyes met Richard's. "I know what I'm talking about," he said. "Give me an hour." Richard studied the older man. Carl was well past his 60s, his face lined with wisdom and years of hard work. He had been a janitor in the building for as long as Richard had been CEO, always quiet, always in the background. But there was something in his voice, something calm and certain. Richard sighed. What did he have to lose? "Fine," he said. "But if you make it worse, I'll have security escort you out." Carl nodded. "Fair enough." Then, without another word, he walked past the team of IT experts and headed straight to the server room. Carl Dawson pushed open the heavy doors of the server room, stepping into a space filled with blinking red lights and the low hum of failing systems. The air was hot, filled with the faint scent of burning circuits. The IT team stood around in frustration, their screens flashing error messages they couldn't decode. Mark, the lead IT engineer, crossed his arms. "All right, Carl. Show us what you got." Carl didn't answer. He walked straight to the main server stack, his fingers brushing the dusty edges of a machine no one had checked in years. He knelt down, pulling a small flashlight from his pocket, and started inspecting the wiring. Mark sighed. "Sir, this is a waste of quiet," Carl muttered. His hands moved with precision, unplugging a faulty cable and reconnecting it with practiced ease. He traced the problem like a detective unraveling a mystery, following wires, tightening connections, and occasionally nodding to himself as if confirming a theory. 5 minutes passed. Then, Carl suddenly stood up and turned to Mark. "You've been trying to restart the system without addressing the overload in the auxiliary power grid." Mark blinked. "What?" Carl pointed to a small panel in the corner. "Your backup power is running, but the main servers are still trying to draw power from the primary system, which is stuck in a loop. You need to reroute the load distribution and manually override the failsafe. Otherwise, the system keeps crashing itself." Mark hesitated. That made sense. But how did Carl, a janitor, know that? "Do it," Carl said. Still skeptical, Mark followed his instructions. He typed a few commands, rerouted the power, and restarted the system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the servers whirred back to life. The error messages disappeared. Data flooded back into the system, screens flashing green instead of red. The IT team gasped. Employees in the office let out relieved cheers as their computers flickered back on. Mark turned to Carl, eyes wide. How did you know that?" Carl wiped his hands on his janitor's uniform. "Because I designed this system 30 years ago." Silence filled the room as Carl's words settled in. "Because I designed this system 30 years ago." Mark's jaw dropped. The IT team exchanged stunned glances. Even Richard, who had just entered the server room, froze in his tracks. "You what?" Richard asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Carl sighed, looking around the room at the blinking servers, the very system he had once built with his own hands. I was the lead systems engineer when this company was just a small startup. I built the original infrastructure, but when new leadership came in, they replaced most of the old team, including me. I lost everything. Richard frowned. And you never fought back? Never went to work somewhere else? Carl let out a dry chuckle. I was already in my 50s when it happened. Try getting a high-level engineering job at that age when the industry prefers fresh graduates. He shook his head. I took what I could. Cleaning floors paid the bills. A heavy silence filled the room that Richard's stomach twisted. He had always prided himself on hiring the best talent, ensuring no one in his company was overlooked. Yet here stood Carl, one of the greatest minds the company had ever seen. Reduced to a janitor's uniform, ignored and forgotten, Carl picked up his mop. Well, the system's back up. I'll let you folks get back to work. He turned to leave, but Richard stopped him. Wait. Carl raised an eyebrow. Richard took a deep breath. Why didn't you ever tell anyone who you were? Carl smirked. Would you have believed me? Richard had no answer to that. Richard's mind raced as he stared at Carl. Here was a man who had once shaped the very foundation of the company, forgotten by time and circumstance. But not anymore. Come with me, Richard said, his voice firm. Carl frowned. Why? Because I don't let brilliance go to waste, Richard replied. Carl hesitated. For years, he had resigned himself to this life. Cleaning floors, emptying trash bins, walking past engineers who never knew that the system they worked on had been designed by the old janitor. But something about Richard's tone made him pause. After a moment, Carl nodded. All right. Richard led Carl back to the boardroom, where the top executives were still discussing the earlier crisis. The moment Carl entered, the murmurs started again. Why is he here? One of them whispered. Richard ignored them and gestured for Carl to stand beside him. Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Carl Dawson. You may know him as our janitor, but what you don't know is that 30 years ago, he was the lead engineer who designed the very system we use today. The room fell in a stunned silence. That's impossible, one executive muttered. Carl crossed his arms. I thought so too, but apparently here we are. Richard turned to Carl. I'm offering you a position, Carl. A real one. Senior systems consultant. You don't belong in a janitor's closet. You belong here, where your mind can be put to use. Carl blinked. For the first time in years, he felt seen, respected. Are you serious? Carl asked. Richard extended his hand. Dead serious. Carl looked at the outstretched hand, then at the faces around him, some still in shock, some nodding in respect. Then, slowly, he grasped Richard's hand and shook it. The room erupted into applause. The news spread through the company like wildfire. Employees whispered in break rooms, shared hushed conversations in hallways, and even the junior engineers spoke in awe about the janitor who turned out to be a forgotten genius. Carl, now officially reinstated as senior systems consultant, walked into his new office, his nameplate freshly engraved. He ran his fingers over the letters, feeling a mixture of emotions. For years, he had been invisible, overlooked. But now, he was back where he belonged. Richard had made sure Carl's return wasn't just a formality. He personally arranged for a full reinstatement of Carl's retirement benefits, ensuring that the years he spent working in obscurity wouldn't go to waste. Carl, however, didn't just settle into his new role. He thrived in it. On his first official day back, Carl attended a meeting with the IT department. He stood at the front of the room, the same place he had once commanded respect decades ago. The younger engineers watched him with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Mark, the lead IT engineer, cleared his throat. So, Mr. Dawson, where do we start? Carl smirked. First lesson, call me Carl. Second lesson, never assume experience is just about age. Knowledge isn't something you discard just because someone doesn't fit your expectations. The team listened intently. Carl continued. Technology moves fast, but principles remain the same. If you don't understand the foundation, you'll keep repeating the same mistakes. He gestured toward the servers. That's why this system nearly crashed today. Not because of bad software, but because no one thought to check the groundwork. The engineers nodded. For the first time, they saw Carl not as a janitor, but as a mentor. A week later, Carl was in his office when a knock sounded on his door. "Come in," he said, expecting one of the engineers. Instead, an older man in an expensive suit stepped inside that Carl's breath caught in his throat. It was David Langston, the very CEO who had forced him out all those years ago. David, now retired, looked at Carl with an unreadable expression. "I heard what happened," he said. "Richard told me." Carl leaned back in his chair. "And?" David sighed. "I made a mistake back then." He hesitated. "No, that's not right. We made a mistake. I was so focused on modernizing the company that I pushed out the people who built its foundation." Carl studied him, looking for insincerity, but found none. David continued, "I know an apology won't change the past, but I wanted to say it anyway." Carl was silent for a moment before nodding. "Took you long enough." David chuckled. "Yeah, it did." They shook hands, this time not as rivals, but as two men who understood the weight of their past decisions. Months passed, and Carl became an invaluable part of the company once again. Employees who once walked past him now sought his advice. But the biggest surprise came when Richard called for an all-company meeting done on the large presentation screen. A new initiative was unveiled, the Carl Dawson Engineering Scholarship Fund. Carl's eyes widened. Richard smiled. This company was built by great minds, and some of those minds don't always get the opportunities they deserve. So, in honor of Carl's contributions, we're launching a scholarship to support young engineers from underprivileged backgrounds. Because talent should never be overlooked. The applause was deafening. Carl, standing at the front of the crowd, felt his throat tighten. For years, he had been discarded, forgotten. But now, his name would live on, not as a janitor, not as someone who was pushed aside, but as a mentor, a legend, a legacy. He wiped a tear from his eye and nodded at Richard. "Thank you." Richard grinned. "No, got it. Thank you."